I'm Miwa Messer. I'm the producer and host of Port Over, and I've been so looking forward to speaking with Timothy Egan. He has written some of my favorite books. The Worst Hard Time was a National Book Award winner, and that is about the great sort of Dust Bowl moment in American history, the Big Burn, about the founding, I suppose we can call it, of the National Forest Service. And of course, the biography of Edward Curtis, Short Nights of the Shadow Catcher. And now, his newest book is now out in paperback. It's called A Fever in the Heartland. It has a very long subtitle, which we will come to in a second. And also, Tim does also happen to have a Pulitzer Prize for work that he did with the New York Times in 2021 on race in America. And I'm so excited to have this conversation. I will also say that David Grann, who folks around our parts know is the author of The Wager, which was one of our big books last year. He's also the author of Killers of the Flower Moon, is also a fan of Timothy Egan's. I'm just going to quote David for a second. With meticulous detective work, Timothy Egan shines a light on one of the most sinister chapters in American history. And I honestly didn't know about this until I read Tim's latest book. So, hi, thank you so much for making the time.
Hey, Miwa, it's great to be with you. I love doing this and happy to help.
So, third generation Westerner, you've lived in Washington State for quite some time, but the new book brings you to Indiana, which I was not expecting. So, can we talk about how you found this story?
Yeah, and so this is a story from 100 years ago. You know what
Yeah.
David Grann and I do, and I was really happy. Thank you for reading that because I've never met him, and to my shock, out of the blue, he loved the book and gave us this wonderful blurb. But what he and I both do is we do some time travel. We go back to a period and we try to get all the textual details right: the smell, the look, the what people were thinking, how they acted socially, what they ate for dinner, what kind of music they listened to, and what their beliefs were. And what I found in this time capsule was exactly 100 yeyears ago. It was exactly 100 years ago that all the peak of this happened. 1924, the Jazz Age, the Great Gatsby era. That it was also, and this has been largely overlooked, it was also the peak of this sadly uniquely American domestic terror group, the Ku Klux Klan. And I didn't know anything about this, and that's one of the attractions for me. And I think David feels the same way: is to be able to tell an untold story. That's what I was able to do with the Dust Bowl, because most people think of the Dust Bowl as Steinbeck. Oh, they all went to California, all these Okies, and instead 2/3 of them didn't go anywhere. So the story was, what was it like to live through the largest man-made disaster at the peak of the worst depression in America? Similarly, in the Klan book, I went back and found a time when 6 million Americans belonged to the Ku Klux Klan. That there were a number of governors who were open sworn Klansmen. There were a number of U.S. senators, and here in Indiana, or there in Indiana, since I'm talking about Washington State, was a complete Klan state. That every member of Congress belonged to the Ku Klux Klan. 1 in 3 white males belonged to the Ku Klux Klan. The mayor of Indianapolis was a Klansman. The governor was a Klansman. So, it got me so really curious about a retelling of the Jazz Age. That, yeah, all this stuff was going on. We can get into this later. That's partially why the Klan flourished. It's a reaction to women going out at night and flappers, Jazz Age, going into clubs and listening to black jazz. And it's a reaction to women getting the vote for the first time, being socially and politically liberated. It's a reaction to, African Americans coming from the South to the North. It's a reaction to the first great large surge of Jewish immigrants coming from Eastern Europe. And so all of this tumult and churn is going on. So I found this rather fascinating, completely intact story, with a middle and an end, almost like a fable of American life in what I call the quintessential American state of Indiana.
My jaw dropped pretty much every other page as I was reading.
I hope you picked it up.
I absolutely did, because I couldn't put the book down. I mean, one of the things you do, and you've done this throughout all of your books, at least for me as a reader, is the pacing in your books is really spectacular, and you reveal information sort of not in a novelistic fashion. I don't want to give people the wrong idea, but you have this excellent sense of storytelling. And I want to spend a minute talking about your background for a second, because yes, you've been a newspaper man for years, and you can talk to anyone and you can interview anyone, but you also have been pretty open about the fact that part of this storytelling comes from your parents. And I'd like to bring them into the conversation for a second, because again, you're a third generation Westerner and Irish American, and there's a lot happening here.
Well, thank you for that opening, Miwa. I haven't been asked about that in a while, and it's something I appreciate you taking an interest in. Yeah, more important than being a journalist, and I was at the New York Times for 30 years. Imbued in my DNA, I like to think, is the Irish storytelling tradition. My father used to say, and he never got a college degree. He drove a Coca-Cola delivery truck. He said he only read two books in his entire adult life. One was How to Win Friends and Influence People, and the other was my Dust Bowl book, The Worst Hard Time, which I dedicated to him just before he died. But he used to say, all we have is words. That's how the Irish have always survived. And cultures are like this. It's not unique to the Irish, certainly. But that's what I grew up with. We had a large family, 9 people in our family, 7 kids. And, compete at the dinner table, you had to be able to tell a story. And then I learned early on, when I was a little kid at the Catholic school, that storytelling was a way to distinguish myself. I couldn't become a pro football player. I wasn't big enough. I tried to become a singer, but my voice sucked, and I realized the storytelling. So, yeah, that really comes out of the family tradition. And the Irish, it goes back to survival, and it's how it's the narrative you bring to the way you live. We came from this, where everything was taken away from, which is what happened to the Irish in England over 8 years. They were culturally emasculated and persecuted, their religion taken away, even the harp was outlawed. So that's exactly right. Now, you touched on something. I don't like to deal with all my methods, but you clearly can see, you don't want to tell, someone said, never tell how the milk gets to the porch.
Right, right.
But the milk does get to the porch in an interesting way. I try to see this thing as whole and drop in little bits and pieces as the story unfolds instead of telling everything at once. And suspense is what I clearly look for. David does the thing. There's a what will happen factor because, I'm telling these histories. In some cases, they're hard histories. But how do I get the reader to read them? Make them want to turn the page. And my idea, of a good book is something that when you close your eyes at night and close the covers, go to sleep, it's still alive.
Yeah.
There's all those people in that thing talking to each other and scheming and going after each other. And then when you open the book again, they pop out again. That's my design. Is I want the book to be alive, suspenseful. And I said, how am I going to get people to read about this pretty awful episode in American history when the Klan came this close to putting a Klansman in the presidential in the White House? How can I get them to read? Well, I tell a simple story and lay it out and make it suspenseful so you don't really know what's going to happen.
But is it the story that grabs you first, or is it the people? Because I feel like you always start with the people and sort of work your way back. I'm not sure I'm right.
Oh, you're right. You're right.
Okay.
You're 2 for 2 right now on your intuitions. The oldest rule of fiction, going back pre-Shakespeare, is that plot follows character.
Right.
That if you have a tragic figure, a tragedy will unfold. If you have a flawed figure, there'll be flaws that lead to that person's downfall. If you have a heroic figure, that heroism, and I have a hero in this book too, a woman who gave her life to basically stop the Klan holding its tracks, the only person who could stop them. So yeah, I start with I try to look for great characters. And to me, they're all living people. I can't make this stuff up.
Right.
Every single thing in this book is true. I have to document it. And it's a problem a lot of times with the nonfiction writers because, you want your characters to do something, but you have to live with the historical record. You've got to stay with what happens. So I look for, in this book, I have an incredible villain. I mean, this guy, E.C. Stevenson, the Grand Dragon, is a Hannibal Lecter of hate. He really is an awful human being. So great, from a storytelling perspective, you've got this awful human being. And then I look for positive people, some people who can fight against this. Then the story unfolds exactly as you said, that the story unfolds from how the characters push and pull against each other.
Right. Part of the fun for me when I'm reading great history, we've all had our experience of textbooks, but when I'm reading history as an adult and engaging with the narrative in a certain way, part of what I'm constantly thinking about is things like, if I had met D.C. Stevenson in a novel, I would have thought, your editor really let you get away with some stuff. This character is too good to be true. It's too on the nose. It's like, you can't make this guy up. And in reality, you didn't have to. And he is to put it kindly, a piece of work. And yet he leaves this record and he's just a con man. He's an absolute, he sells the world on this image. I mean, he's marketing himself in a way where you're just like, huh, okay, guy. So how did you find him?
One of my ideas, was because I'm in Indiana, the Music Man, we got trouble around in River City. Maybe an old reference, but it still was just resurrected on Broadway a couple of years ago. He was sort of a music man of hate. He would go from town to town, the actual heart of America, the heartland of America, and he was a small parts salesman. He busted out of the army. He ditched a wife and kid in Oklahoma. He changed his background so many times, saying he was a lawyer, saying he came from a wealthy family. But in truth, he was just a classic American con man. And he tried a whole bunch of different things to get rich, selling, these different parts and going door to door, going town to town. And he never made any money.
Right.
Till he hit on the Klan in 1921. And in 4 short years, he goes from nobody who rolls in like a tumbleweed to ruling the upper Midwest. That's the story I try to tell. Now, I hate to say this, though. Look, I'm a positive American. I learn from our history. I think the good and the bad of our history informs us and makes us better persons, whole persons, more nuanced people because we understand the history. But Stevenson represents our ability to fall for a con man. I mean, people always ask me when they read this book, how could so many people fall for this guy? I mean, he preached alcohol temperance. You shouldn't drink. It was the time of prohibition. They outlawed alcohol in every square foot of America. And yet he was a bootlegger and a raging alcoholic. He preached Christian virtues. Don't tell a lie. Don't covet your neighbor's wife. And he told 20 lies before he got out of bed in the morning. Some of them sent out by his vast network. He preached sexual abstinence and the purity of women. And he was a sexual predator and a rapist, and even more than that, a monster. So, everything he preached and said to his followers, and at one point, there's this amazing scene in the book. It was the scene I saw so cinematically. It's the 4th of July in Kokomo, Indiana. And it's the largest Klan gathering in the history of the world. 200,000 Klansmen and Klanswomen. And they also had a group, sadly, called the Ku Klux Kiddies, out in the prairie on 4th of July of this little town of Kokomo, Indiana. And they look up at the sky, and here's a plane that descends with KKK underneath it. And it drops down onto the field. And out steps D.C. Stevenson with his purple robe. And they all bow to him like he's Christ.
Yep.
And so he had this sway, this power. So one of the things I'm trying to do is, how does one person get so much control over his fellow citizens?
We are going to dance around some of the content in the book only because I consider them spoilers. The way you tell the story.
Yes,
I mean, and we are going to get to Madge, but there's a way to tell her story without giving up lots of detail. Because again,
I really appreciate that, by the way.
Yeah, we can do this.
Told me a long time ago when I was started in the book tour business, they said, "Dad, don't give away the story." Yeah.
No. We will not do that because there's something to be said for sitting with this story. And I'm a very quick reader, and this is not actually a book that I tore through. I had to sit sort of here and there and really consider what's happening because, we talk about the 1920s and the Great Gatsby and the Flappers and everything else. Gatsby, of course, doesn't even work as a book until the 40s and 50s when it's been given to soldiers in a free, right?
Yeah, Fitzgerald considered it a failure.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah, Fitzgerald considered Gatsby a failure. I mean, it sold only like 10,000 copies in the 1920s.
Yeah. But Edith Wharton, I think it was The Age of Innocence, comes out in 1921. Well, Sinclair Lewis has like 4 bestsellers in a row. I think we've got Arrowhead, Babbitt, Main Street. And people don't really think about Sinclair Lewis, but he had been a muckraker. So when you look at sort of, I'm going to use literature as the sort of barometer for the moment because it's easier than if we go too deep into music and everything else. There's this moment where you can see America trying to figure itself out.
Yes,
But
very well
all of
put.
these people in the 20s looking back and going, 1890, we like that. We really like that moment. How do we get that back? And so once again, we see this sort of not quite a century of change, and everyone's sort of freaking out. It's like, oh, you know that Arthur Schlesinger book, The Cycles of American History?
Yeah.
Oh, I should have maybe taken that a little more seriously in high school.
Yeah. Well, because he should course through. Yeah.
Yeah, that was the one thing that really kept hitting me as I was reading Fever in the Heartland was, hey, wait a minute. I know we're talking about the 20s. I know the people in the 20s are referring to the turn of their last, all of these moments where I'm kind of like, wait a minute. We've been here before. And that's part of the power of reading history, right? Like,
Yeah.
we're supposed to be able to learn from what came before.
Right.
And this all feels really, really familiar in ways that were uncomfortable. Let's put it
Hmm.
that way.
Yeah. That's correct. Yes.
So, for you writing this book, though, and obviously you have the detachment of someone who's written multiple books, you have the detachment of someone who has worked as a journalist. Like, that's the ultimate. You have to step back and be detached in order to tell that kind of story. But here you are surrounded by first person documentation and court transcripts and letters and memoirs and first person statements. This is a lot
It
of
is.
information, and some of it is really ugly.
Yeah.
How do you stay focused? How do you hold on to the story? How do you not stand in a corner and bang your head against a wall?
Yeah, that's a great question because, one of the things I remember, I had this sort of image when I was working on the Dust Bowl book. It was all around this, really the forgotten part of America, the high plains of Western Kansas and Oklahoma. Actually, nobody lives there anymore. These towns they're all dying on the vine. I'm talking to these people in their 90s, and mostly women who lived through the Dust Bowl, and these are amazing, moving things. And for me, there was always a moment when one of these women would go back and just go, give me a minute here. And they would come back with a shoebox and they would open their shoebox. And out of the shoebox would pop all this wonderful living history, pictures, letters, notes from the dirty 30s. In the Klan thing, my shoebox out popped a bunch of skeletons, ghosts, really awful stuff. Now, there's a scene in the book near the end, town of Noblesville, which is where the trial of D.C. Stevenson, and the last third of the book is a trial.
Yep.
And actually, Grisham was my model for the last third of the book. Have this thriller trial. You don't know what's going to happen. And in quintessential Indiana, where actually 40% of the people who live there belong to the Klan. Could they possibly convict the Grand Dragon of the Klan? But 50 years after Stevenson's events, the townsfolk found a chest in a barn. It was the guy who was remodeling a barn, and this thing had been locked for half a century, and they opened this chest, and it's like, oh my God, Grandpa was a Klansman, and it's a roster of everyone in this county, in this quintessential perfect American town, really beautiful town, Noblesville, Indiana. How many? 10,000 people belong to the Klan in this little town. That's in that chest. And they decided to close it and not let anybody see it for another like 15 years. Luckily, I was able to see it. So, when I'm doing this research, I'm not only going all over Indiana and trying to get the field texture because, the wind is different there than the Pacific Northwest where I live. The sky is different than the Pacific Northwest. I wanted to understand the music. Jazz was really breaking out. And part of its birthplace was Indiana, which is one of the amazing sides. Louis Armstrong cuts the first record of African American jazz on the day of the largest Klan rally in this little town's history. Louis Armstrong cuts this thing that outlives the Klan by 100 years. And, so I'm doing this research, and it's unbelievable because it wasn't a secret history. It's fallen into the memory hole.
Right.
Every newspaper from the 20s had something on the Klan. And some of those stories were like really positive, Klan to hold picnic today, Klan lemonade sale, Klan to give out presents to orphanage, and so it's a living history that just completely fell into the memory hole. But it was tough, especially the latter. You read these feelings. Now, here's an interesting thing, which we haven't touched on yet. Everyone thinks of the Klan as this racist group. And they were. But there were three iterations of the Klan. The first was formed after the Civil War, and it was formed for one reason, Mila, because suddenly in the South, 1 in 3 Americans is a free American. They're no longer human property. They're no longer enslaved. And so that causes a backlash and forms the first Klan. President Grant comes in, crushes them. And there's a great book by Ron Chernow, a biography of Grant, that gives Grant credit. He was thought of as this alcoholic and this. In fact, he was a great president in so many factors. He crushed the Klan. They're dead for 50 years. And then they pop up again in this second iteration in the 1920s. It's like, where the hell does this come from? Here's where it came from. They expand the range of hatreds. Instead of just hating blacks, which was they still hate blacks, they hate Jews. Because millions of Jews are coming to the country from pogroms in Eastern Europe. They hate progressive women or socially liberated women. Forget about the political label, just women who were flappers. My grandma was a flapper, and she used to talk about going out to this flop house in this basement club and getting drunk on bootleg gin and dancing all that. She had a great time. They really fear that because it goes against the hearth and home image of women. They are afraid of modernism itself. That we've come out of this World War, we've come out of this pandemic, and America just doesn't seem the same. So much is going on. They harken back to this earlier America of 40 years ago. So there's all this churn going on, and that's what they're reacting to. So they expand the range of hatreds. And also, this is what was really interesting. Their hatreds are regional. In Utah, of all places, the Klan hated Mormons. I mean, Mormons were on their list of hatreds. In California, they mainly hated Asians and Latinos in the LA area. So it's just and Catholics they hated because they were primarily immigrant, Italian and Irish. So they opened up this whole range of hatreds. And that was one of the reasons why they expanded so quickly, because people who saw, America is an idea, not a tribe. America is an idea, not a religion. But the Klan thought America's one race and one religion, and suddenly there's all these races and all these religions.
That nativism, right? That nativism has never served anyone. We've seen it in Europe, we've seen it in Asia, we've seen it across the globe. Nativism there are countries now whose populations are shrinking dramatically because they don't believe in immigration. Right. I was thinking quite a lot, actually, about the Big Burn as I was reading Fever in the Heartland, because and for those of you who don't know the Big Burn, please go back and read it, but it is the largest wildfire in American history. It was 3 million acres over 2 days. The U.S. Forest Service had just been created by Teddy Roosevelt, and the timber barons and the railroad guys, they were all mad about it, and they were just like, oh, you've got all these kids from Yale trying to do things, we're not interested. And of course, this is all happening in a Western U.S. that looks like Deadwood.
Right.
So if you've seen Deadwood, you know what I'm
in the book. I got to use that.
Feel free.
I particularly like the Deadwood part because it was like that.
Yeah, no. I mean,
they shot these forest rangers.
Right. It's completely nuts. But part of who ends up fighting the fire, right? And we're fighting a wildfire on a scale that we had not as a country seen before. Buffalo soldiers.
Right.
Convicts and immigrants.
Correct. That's who fought the fire.
They shut the fire down.
Well, they saved at least 3 towns in Idaho. Right. When the Buffalo soldiers showed up, they like doubled the black population of Idaho just by having a camp there. But yeah, they were absolutely heroic.
But I'm also thinking about how we get to, Charles Lindbergh and his nativism. And there was a Klan rally at Madison Square Garden in 1930. And also Nazis. We had lots of Nazis in New York, too. And we see this thread sort of running through, and it all comes back to nativism, to a vision of America that honestly is not accurate. It's
no,
really
that's
not.
Right. It's you never see. I mean, this is not a political observation, but religion is not mentioned in the Constitution. God is not mentioned in the Constitution. For the simple reason I only learned this in great detail when I did my book on the Irishman, because they were reacting to the European state and church being one and the same. Right. That you had to belong to this religion or you could face the stake. You had to belong to this religion or you could not own property. So when we found our Constitution, we don't put a state religion. It's really simple. It's people forget that. That's the founding idea of America, is we're not one religion. All faiths can function here. But as you accurately pointed out, what runs through this cycle is a sense that, we've got to make this country about one religion and one race, which is never the idea, just like you said. So blacks fought in the Revolutionary War
Mm-hmm.
Starting in 1776. Blacks fought in the Civil War. And, we've always had this mix, but people harken back. Now, one of the things I learned in the Irish book was 1852, the second largest political party in the United States was called the Know Nothing Party. And what were they all about? They were all about preventing the people who'd been the first wave of immigrants, which happened to be Irish, my people, preventing them from being citizens. And they, again, they had a presidential candidate. They had their day. And it was a reaction to the changing face of America. So we see this constantly. But then our better angels come around too. So I mean, I don't want to, this is never it's never static. Okay. It's never static.
It's never static, but we also have to remember to tell the complete story.
Correct.
And that's part of, I don't want to sound too slick about it, but the part of the fun, right, of going back in time. Let's treat history like it is time travel, because
Yes.
reading history, you can read the established historians, you can read up and coming historians. Ned Blackhawk has a great book that won the National Book Award last year called The Rediscovery of America, which is telling our history from the indigenous perspective. And I am absolutely smarter having read that book, because that was a huge gap. Like, I knew King Philip's War and that was about it. And that's because I grew up in Massachusetts.
Yeah.
Like, the gaps are always there. And that's why reading history is so important for me. Like, I didn't really know about the founding of the U.S. Forestry Service. Do I enjoy a national park? Oh, yes, I do.
Yeah.
I'm delighted that we've been able to preserve all of this space. I mean, you're out in Bryce or Zion, and it's just...
Ken Burns said it was America's best idea.
Yeah, without a doubt.
One of the things we exported to the world was the idea that all of us as citizens of this democracy own a piece of that huge land.
Right. Or if you're out in the desert, like you're out in Joshua Tree or out in Death Valley, I mean, it's like being on Mars.
It is.
It's
I
completely
love
bananas.
I love both Joshua Tree and Death Valley, particularly in February when Seattle's looking pretty bad.
Right? And we don't have rain, where are you? But if we don't keep these stories going, and you always let your characters speak, and that's the thing that I appreciate most. You turn to the record and you say, where am I pulling this information from, and how can I cite There are 31 pages of sources for Fever in the Heartland. And I mean, everything is there. Every detail, you have a way of saying, and this is the letter it came from, and this is the document it came from, and here are the records it came from. This isn't you saying, well, so-and-so might have felt this way because it was Tuesday, and oh, right, the Klan.
Right.
This is, I'm taking the historical record and I'm creating a reading experience. I'm creating a learning experience that makes you want to engage with the work because of the way the story is told.
Yeah, that's, again, another great observation, because this is the only, so I've written 10 books, nine books of nonfiction, one book of fiction. And that fiction is by heart. Making stuff up is much harder than but this story, and this is the main reaction I get from people, is so on the surface unbelievable. People keep saying, I can't believe this went on. I never heard of this. This is shocking that we had this level, that we, again, this is a domestic terror group of people who put their hand on a Bible and swear to go against every principle of our Constitution and swear that, half of Americans are their enemy. And so I put a little author's note at the front of this book. I've never done this before, never done it. And it says simply, the following story is true. Every word of dialogue, every letter is either from a court testimony, a letter, a newspaper quote. I didn't do any of this, he would have thought this, which I don't believe in, by the way. I think nonfiction writers cheat when they do that. He or she may have thought they were doing this. Now, one little side note on that. When I did the Dust Bowl story, I had diaries, mainly of women, and it told me what they were thinking on a certain day. So, especially the despair. I mean, the woman would say, oh God, day 29, I look out the window and I don't see anything but a wall of dirt coming at me. My heart breaks for this. So I would write into the book, her heart broke with despair. And people said, how do you know she was despairing on the 29th of August? I said, well, I have a diary entry from the 29th of August,
right,
where she said, so that you're right. And this book, because I thought people just wouldn't believe it, I had to footnote the crap out of it. Not footnote it, but source note. I don't like footnotes because it interrupts the flow.
right.
But you could go back and look at any of this to see the proof of the pudding.
Well, we tell on ourselves, right? If we tell the truth about who we are and where we've come from, And if we really own it, we just tell on ourselves. And I
Yes.
do think that leaves some people profoundly uncomfortable about a lot of things. But the thing that kept surprising me as I read Fever is how much felt like it could have been happening in this moment. Even though I'm reading about bathtub gin and bobbed hair
Right.
and, the 1920s, it really disinformation campaigns, like so much of what we have seen even through the 70s, even through, the 80s and 90s and into the present day and whatnot, that this groundwork has not shifted as much as maybe we might have presumed it would have over a century. That's the piece that I keep coming back to is we're talking about a story that's 100 years old.
Yeah.
And it feels very contemporary.
Well, we've changed a lot of laws. So the Klan's big legislative accomplishments in the 1920s, they did three things they wanted. These were their main goals. To outlaw alcohol, which Winston Churchill called the biggest affront to civilization, in the history of the world. Of course, Churchill never went any 24-hour period without alcohol in his blood. So you have to put that there. So it was an audacious social experiment. Outlaw alcohol everywhere. That was number one. Number two, a new immigration law that basically tried to make America look like it looked in the 1890s. Basically made Asian immigration was completely outlawed. It made it almost impossible for Jews to come to this country and Southern Europeans. They didn't like, Sicilians, Italians, Greeks. They were darker skinned Europeans. So that was number two, the immigration bill. And then number three was Jim Crow of the North. We think of Jim Crow as a Southern thing, but a lot of cities in Indiana, they outlawed blacks from living in certain neighborhoods. They put up this big fence around this guy a dentist who tried to live in their neighborhood. They had this thing called the White Citizens League. So Jim Crow to the North. So they got all three things done, but all three things have since been taken off the books. So I want to emphasize that. It's the cycles we go through.
Right.
We no longer have those. We passed the Civil Rights Law. We got rid of Jim Crow on the books. It's off the books because of the Civil Rights Law. You can't tell someone they can't live in a neighborhood anymore legally. People still try to do it, but you can't legally do that anymore. Alcohol's in every square corner of Indiana in particular. Yes, you study history, you read history, you write about history because it has resonance to today. It's not a dead story. It's not, I think history is a living thing. It's alive in the way we are today. And this story popped out as, holy cow, here's our dark side. Here's the thing that courses through our history, going back to the Know Nothing movement. But also here's some people who made it better. So, you write about these things to give people a little roadmap of how we were before and how we can get out of how we were before, too. So I don't do it to shame people. I do it to give them a roadmap as well.
For me as a reader, too, to be able to say, oh, right, here's this point, here's another point, and just to be able to go forward. But knowing how well you researched this book, knowing that the first person sourcing, like you had to do a lot of time talking to people and sitting in archives, and I'm sure the dust was, off the charts. But the fact that you rely on the record to speak for itself, right. And you let people who, yes, obviously many of them are dead now, but also many of them have descendants. And so the idea that you are actually letting history speak for itself and not just saying, well, I'm trying to make a point.
I think the point should be made in the course of the book. I never come out and say, hey, did you learn this lesson or this? I never do that. I tell a story. And if you can't see something from this story, well, then I've failed because the story should give you the lesson. You don't, you don't preach. I don't preach in these things. I don't give political points. I tell the story and let people come to the water, as it were. Now, also, you're very good at figuring out my methods, and I don't like to tell what I'm
Sorry.
up to. But I think it's so much more powerful to have a first-person voice saying, and then we did this, and me telling it in an authorial way. So I always look for anytime I can have a first-person quote of someone saying, we actually did this, and it just makes it more urgent. Yeah, that's one of the things I look for. And I'll give Indiana credit for this. They have a superb record of what happened to them in the 1920s. This story is not lost. It's just been forgotten. It's there. And the archivists at the Indiana State Library and the Indiana Historical Society were superb. I mean, but I just had a bazillion holy cow moments. I just like, how is this thing under lock and key? It's all there. So yeah, you're right. And that's where you find those first person things. The strongest first person thing in the book, try to tell this without giving anything away.
Right.
Well, again, this is the story of the Grand Dragon who takes over a state for the Ku Klux Klan. 1 in 3 white males join it. And by 1924, he's on the eve of, he's controlling both presidential nominations. He's on the cover of Time magazine.
Yep.
They influenced the 1924, and then they're looking at going to the 1928 election, putting a Klansman in the White House. They march 50,000 people down the streets of Washington, proudly proclaiming their hate. So they're this powerful. So what happens is the Grand Dragon has come to justice at some point. He has to face the music of he's a monster.
Yeah.
And he's committed, he just ups his scale of evil. So at one point, and then for several years, he goes around getting away with stuff and saying, I am the law.
Mm-hmm.
I am the law. And he's pretty close to telling the truth. A lot of cops are Klansmen, judges are Klansmen, prosecutors are Klansmen, certainly the governor's a Klansman. So no wonder he says, I am the law. But there's one woman who he can't get around, and that's the subtitle of my book, And the Woman Who Stopped Them. And as much as I like the great people in history, I love these people at the margins.
Yeah.
Who get written out of the story. And you see in the Big Burn, there's a lot of people like that who are there's Teddy Roosevelt doing this and that, but there's also a lot of people at the edges, and you mentioned the Buffalo Soldiers. And in this story, one of the people who's not a grand historic figure, but it does change history, is one woman. And she's a person of her age. She's educated. She doesn't feel like she has to get married yet. She's in her 20s. She travels alone with her friend all the way, a girlfriend, across the United States when there's no interstate highway system. She's lively, opinionated, fun, goes out at night, has several boyfriends over the course of her thing. She just won't take any crap from a guy like this, but she has to go to him to save her job. Mm-hmm. She's in charge of the state literacy program. Mm-hmm. Now, to the question of the first person, at one point she writes a long, how do I put this without giving away the story?
It's let's say she gives a statement of fact.
Right.
Which is then delivered to someone else.
Okay,
I think that gives us enough space.
That's her voice.
Right.
At a very, very perilous point in her life. And also a very dangerous point in the United States, where literally a hinge moment where the Klan could go like this or go like this. And so she writes out in this great detail at a very perilous point in her life what this man's like. The monstrosity, the depth of his evil, the stuff he does to people and the stuff he did to her. Really awful stuff. I mean, he's cannibalistic at one point. And that's an example, to go back to your original question, of using the power of someone's voice, the first person. I didn't go tell, I just laid it out. I brought her voice into the pages of the book, and that's where I was channeling Grisham, where you've got someone really powerful, in a legal setting. So that's a long way of saying, the first person can be so powerful.
Also, the stakes are so high.
They really
are.
They're
so relatable. And there is genuinely no predicting how a jury, because again, we've mentioned that there's a trial in the last third of the book, how the jury is going to respond. I mean, predicting juries and their behavior. Yes, there's voir dire and all of this, there's a whole process, and there are consultants and da-da-da-da. But at the same time, they're human beings. Juries are made up of human beings, and human beings make decisions.
And you only need one juror to have a hung jury. And also, this is taking place in a county where I mentioned earlier, 40% of the people, these are their folks. They have a newspaper in this town of Noblesville. Every day it publishes a little homily, a positive thing called Klan Comment. And it's like the positive things the Klan is doing for America. I mean, so it's accepted as like, the Rotary Club. Mm-hmm. And so could a jury possibly convict the man that a third of the state is taking their orders from. That's the sort of suspense thing at the heart of the last third of the book.
But going back to that too, the whole Klan comment in the newspaper, I mean, a women's auxiliary, a children's auxiliary.
Right.
It's a lifestyle. You could shop at stores where you knew you could shop with confidence that you were with people who understood you exactly, and they were, I guess we could even call them Klan stores, right? It wasn't just an idea, it was an embodiment, it was a goal, it was a structure.
Well, I think that explains one of the reasons why it was so popular.
Right.
If you look at these oral histories, there's a sociologist named Kathleen Blee who went back a few years ago and did a bunch of interviews. This is when they were still alive. When I went back, they were all dead, but still alive. She interviewed women in the Klan. She talked about what was the attraction. Yeah, first 20 minutes of the interview, they wouldn't minute. They were so ashamed. And then once she got them going, they said, well, there was a real sense of belonging. There was a real sense of we were all the same under our hoods. And the hoods gave them anonymity, so it made it even more powerful. And they had this children's brigade called the Ku Klux Kiddies. So yeah, there was a sense that that this powerful thing, that you were part of this larger than life thing. Now, never forget what this larger than life thing was all about. Though it was all about hatred. It was the golden age of the so-called fraternal organizations. The Elks, the Brotherhood, they had secret codes and wore little outfits, and it's basically silly stuff, And the largest fraternal organization in America, and I double checked this, was the Ku Klux Klan. Now they would have their little secret codes, their little secret rituals, but they also put their hand on that Bible and sworn out that oath to, quote, forever uphold white supremacy. It's a pretty strong thing for pretty strong statement for an American to put his hand on a Bible for. Especially when that Bible contains a Christian admonition to love your neighbor as yourself.
And also, given our native populations and our indigenous population, it's wild for me as an American in 2024 looking back and just saying, right. I mean, the way we teach history, the way we experience history, and again, history it's a living document. It doesn't become this stale thing that you just slide on the shelf. You can go back and look at histories that were written, say, in 1935 about pieces of America. I mean, I specifically laugh about this. I grew up in Massachusetts, so can we talk about Pilgrims for a second and how we get to reevaluate, half of my grade school education, all of the things I was taught in a classroom. And certainly looking back on the Revolutionary War and the Civil War and all of these moments where we really can now go back and say, hey, we kind of got that narrative wrong. We really got it wrong for a really long time.
I've got a really good friend from Massachusetts, and I always give him a bad time. I said, I only realized in the last 20 years reading these sort of revisionist books, just more accurate books on the Pilgrims. And I said, wait a minute, they land there and they immediately start stealing the winter food of the people who live there.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and they thought this was a blessing from God. I mean, if someone came into your town and took all your winter food, you would call them a thief. You wouldn't call them, so I said, these pilgrims stole all their food, and then, they didn't intentionally spread the disease. In some cases they did later on. They would have these smallpox blankets. But so, yeah, you're right. I mean, it's now the question that Ken Burns and other people have asked, we've had this raging debate about our history, how do we teach our history?
Right.
How do we incorporate our history? Do we not teach history that we're afraid of? Do we not teach history that makes us feel bad? I think seeing the larger picture, do you not know what your family was like? Want to know what your family was like? Gives us a more nuanced view and helps us. I think to live in darkness with a blinder on doesn't allow you to live as a human being.
I think we need to be able to see as complete a picture. I mean, and I say this as someone who's part Japanese, and, we have a tricky history with Japanese Americans and camps. And, you've got some people saying, well, it's incarceration. You've got some people saying, well, it was internment. And I'm saying it happened here. Well, and I've walked around Manzanar, and it's very strange to walk around Manzanar.
President I absolutely revere, Franklin Roosevelt.
Right.
The great blot on his 4 terms is, internment. And
9066. Those are numbers you don't really forget.
How do you look at FDR, saving the world from the Nazis and basically pulling the country out of the Great Depression? And I can name 25 other great things he did with that blot. Well, you look at it with all that nuance of that. He also was pretty much cheating on his wife quite a bit too. He and Eleanor never had sex for 20 years. They stayed together in the public eye. Well, he had a series of mistresses. So does that make me not like FDR? No, but it makes me see him in a fuller view.
And that's what I'm hoping we get from continuing to publish all pieces of history and, revisions of, just because we believed it once doesn't mean it's the thing that goes forward.
Exactly.
We have to be able to look at ourselves as a complete entity, right? And the fact that we're evolving and we're changing and we're learning, and even language, right? Language changes. And hopefully we'll just continue to let folks speak for themselves, but we give a wider range of voices.
Right.
And we let more people speak for themselves and not just say, oh, right, that was published in 1942. That's great. Let's just go with that. That's the thing. And we can just use this as the standard. I mean, we evolve, story evolves, and we get more books out of it too, which is kind of great.
I can't say it any better than you, so I'm going to let you. That's very well said.
This is what happens when you get a history nerd who ends up being a bookseller. We have opinions about things. Can I ask if you figured out what the next thing is, though? I mean, because you take your time between books. So
I do, and I'm really anxious when I don't have a book.
Right.
I mean, storytelling is what gives me my forward motion. I love my family, and I love life, and I love nature, and I love cooking, and I love a million other things. But I can't get out of bed in the morning if I don't have a story I want to tell. So I bounced around. I looked at a couple things, and then I found this wonderful story of a Buffalo soldier, the first Black graduate of West Point, a guy named Henry Flipper, who goes west in 1877. And it's convergence point of all the stuff going on in the American West, the very end of the Indian Wars. Reconstruction has ended. They've just pulled troops out of Texas. He's the first Black officer anywhere in the United States. First Black graduate of West Point. The eyes of the world are on him. And he's a real Westerner. I mean, he really, he's a lasso throwing, horse riding, gun slinging, but he's also a West Point graduate who speaks 3 languages, and is a real gentleman, officer and a gentleman. It's sort of the West at that point told through him. And the first, to go back to what you said earlier, he left 2 wonderful memoirs, totally forgotten to time. One was his time at West Point called The Colored Cadet, and the other was his time in the West called The Negro Frontiersman. So I can get in his head, which is what it looks for. So what I try to do, and what several other practitioners of my genre try to do, is we tell something that reads like a novel. Mm-hmm. It's not. It's a true story. That's called narrative nonfiction. And narrative nonfiction is not, great man history. I mean, there's plenty of people who could tell you the story of the railroad, the story of the war won, the story of the town built, the story of these. The reason there are statues because this person behind the statue did something. That's not my game. That's not what a bunch of us in the narrative nonfiction do. We try to tell a really tight story.
Yep.
We find an episode of history, and we boil it down like you're reducing a sauce to make a really good meal. We just reduce until it's there. So narrative nonfiction is what I try to do with my telling of the Klan. And so Fever in the Heartland is a book that should be suspenseful because you've never heard of this and you don't know how it ends up.
It is a really satisfying read. It is not breezy. It is well told. It is very interesting. It's very entertaining in parts too, but it is a very thoughtful history. And it's a very thoughtful portrait of us. And I say us as a country and a civilization, however you want to define us, because it is a portrait of America.
It's kind of surprised me. I didn't know the story would find such a large audience. I've been very gratified. It's rather shocking to me, actually.
It's hopeful. I think it's hopeful.
Yeah, that good.
But this is where I'm going to say thank you very much, Timothy Egan. It was so great to spend this hour with you. We really appreciate you. A Fever in the Heartland is out in paperback. If you haven't somehow picked up The Worst Hard Time or The Big Burn, or I always have to double check the title, Short Nights of the Shadowcatcher, which is the Edward Curtis biography. And the Irish book that Tim kept referencing is The Immortal Irishman. And it's quite a lot of fun. So thank you so much.
Thank you. My pleasure. Wonderful interview.
Thank you for listening. Poured Over is a Barnes & Noble production. To help other readers find us, please rate and review the show wherever you listen to podcasts.